At 48, I learned my son and his wife had already picked out a name for the house I was still living in. Not a nickname, a listing name. The Fixer-Upper on Maple Street. My daughter, meanwhile, was being handed the keys to a brand new apartment downtown, paid for, they said, because she needed a fresh start. I said nothing. I smiled, poured more coffee, and let them think I hadn't heard. But what I discovered 3 days later changed everything. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and for most of my life, people have underestimated me. I don't blame them. I'm soft-spoken, I wear cardigans in June because I'm always a little cold, and I taught second grade for 11 years before I became a hospice nurse. If you've ever met a hospice nurse, you know we learn to hold enormous things very quietly. We learn that the loudest grief in the room is rarely the most important one. I carried that lesson long after I left nursing, long after my husband Daniel died, long after I thought I understood what my own family was capable of. Daniel and I bought the house on Maple Street in 1998 in the small town of Millbrook, Ohio. It wasn't a grand house. Blue clapboard, a wraparound porch Daniel built himself, a kitchen window over the sink that looked out at the maple tree we planted the year our son Peter was born. We were young and broke and happy in the way only young, broke people can be, when the future still looks like something you're building instead of something already used up. Daniel worked at the plant outside town for 26 years. I picked up nursing shifts wherever I could, raised Peter and his younger sister Claire, and fell in love with a life that looked, from the outside, unremarkable. It wasn't. It was the best thing I've ever had. Every evening, no matter the season, Daniel sat on that porch with a glass of iced tea and said, "Ellie, we did all right, didn't we?" Not really a question, more like a small prayer he liked to say out loud. He died 4 years ago. Heart attack, fast, no warning. I found him in the garage, and for a long time afterward, I couldn't go in there without my hands starting to shake. Grief does strange things to a house. It makes every room feel like it's holding its breath. After Daniel died, my children rallied around me, some days more than others. But grief, I learned, is also a kind of audit. It shows you who was really there and who was performing being there. I didn't see the difference clearly at first. Loneliness makes you generous with your gratitude in ways that aren't always earned. I want to be honest with you. I am not a woman who screams. I have never once raised my voice at my children. I was the kind of mother who sat down at the kitchen table, folded her hands, and asked quiet questions until the truth came out on its own. Daniel used to tease me about it. "You don't argue, Ellie," he said once. "You just wait people out." He wasn't wrong. But waiting people out only works if the people you're waiting on still respect the time they're taking from you. That respect, I would soon learn, had quietly expired. It started small. Peter's wife, Danielle, began stopping by more often after Daniel passed. She'd bring banana bread. She'd ask about my knees, my blood pressure, whether I'd thought about downsizing. At first, I took it as kindness. A daughter-in-law worried about her aging mother-in-law alone in a 4-bedroom house. I might have worried about it myself in her position. But there is a particular tone people use when they are planning your future without you, and once you learn to hear it, you cannot unhear it. It uses the word "we" a lot. We just think it might be time. We want what's best for you. I began to notice that "we" almost never included me, even when the topic was my own life. The maple tree Daniel and I planted the year Peter was born had grown taller than the house by then. Some mornings I'd stand at that kitchen window with my coffee and watch the light come through its branches. I didn't know yet that somebody had already started measuring me for a smaller life. I only knew that something in the air of my own home had changed, the way weather changes before you can name the storm. The night everything cracked open was an ordinary Tuesday. Peter and Danielle had come for dinner, along with my grandchildren, Lily and Sam, ages 9 and 7. Claire had joined too, home from Columbus, freshly moved into what she casually mentioned was the new place downtown. I hadn't heard about a new place. I asked gently how she'd managed it, since Claire had been between jobs and I knew her savings were thin. Peter and Danielle helped, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. It's a really nice building, doorman and everything. I looked at my son. He was studying his hands, the way he does when he's uncomfortable. That's generous, I said, meaning it, though something cold had already started moving through my chest. How did you manage that? We've just been doing some reorganizing, Danielle said smoothly, reaching for the green beans. Financially, getting things in order. I didn't push. I asked instead about Lily's school play, and I watched my family eat the dinner I'd cooked in the kitchen my husband had built, and I felt, for the first time in my life, like a guest in my own home. It was later that night, rinsing dishes at that same window, that I overheard something I was never meant to hear. My phone had lit up on the counter with a message to a family group chat I'd been quietly added to months earlier and mostly ignored. Danielle had sent a message to the group, except this time, for reasons I'll never know, my name hadn't been the one she meant to include. Once we get her settled somewhere smaller, it read, the Maple Street place is worth way more than people think. Peter says it's basically ours once she's out. We just have to handle it delicately so she doesn't feel pushed. I stood at that sink for a long time, water running, thinking with a strange calm that I had spent 30 years pouring myself into people who had already, in their minds, poured me out. I didn't cry that night. Some betrayals are too large for tears at first. They need to be understood before they can be grieved. I dried my hands and sat at that kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning, letting the truth settle into the room like dust after something has fallen. What I discovered 3 days later, when I finally opened a manila envelope sitting unopened in Daniel's desk since the week after his funeral, would change everything I thought I understood about my life and about the people I had raised. For 3 days, I said nothing. I made Sunday dinner. I asked Peter about work. Grief teaches you to function through pain, and betrayal, I was learning, requires the same discipline. On the 3rd day, a memory had surfaced, insistent and strange. Daniel, in the last year of his life, sitting me down at this same table and saying, in the careful voice he used only for things that mattered, Ellie, if anything ever happens to me, you look in my desk, middle drawer, way at the back. At the time I'd assumed he meant ordinary paperwork, and I'd never gone looking. I went to his desk that afternoon and found the envelope beneath old tax returns. Inside was a letter in Daniel's handwriting, and beneath it, a folder of documents from an attorney's office in Columbus I had never heard of. Daniel's letter began, Ellie, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've finally had a reason to look. I'm sorry I never told you about this while I was alive. I didn't want you to worry, and I didn't want the kids to know because I love them. But I've watched the way Peter talks about this house since we built the addition, like it's already an asset instead of a home. I did some things quietly with a lawyer I trust to make sure that whatever happens after I'm gone, nobody can make decisions about your life or this house without your full and complete consent. You are the sole owner, Ellie, not a joint owner. Not a beneficiary who has to share. The sole owner, outright, in a trust I set up specifically so no one could pressure you out of it. I love you. Don't let anyone make you feel small in the home we built together. I sat with that letter for a long time. Daniel, who I thought had told me everything, had spent the last year of his life protecting me from a future he must have suspected, even then. The folder held a full trust agreement, drawn up 18 months before Daniel died, transferring the house entirely into my name, structured specifically so it couldn't be classified as shared family property in any dispute. Tucked toward the back was an email exchange referencing Peter's inquiries about the property's market value and concerns about pressure being placed on Eleanor regarding assisted living options prematurely. My husband had known, or at least suspected, and had spent his last healthy months quietly building me a wall he wouldn't be alive to stand behind. I thought about a conversation from months earlier when Danielle had asked, almost idly, whether I'd ever considered one of those lovely retirement communities. I'd laughed it off. I'm not there yet, honey. She'd smiled. Of course not. Just something to think about down the road. I understood now that road was shorter than I'd assumed and already mapped. It would have been easy to call Peter and scream at him. Some younger, more wounded version of me might have. But I am not that woman, and I understood something my son and his wife apparently did not. The quietest people in a room are often the ones who have already won the argument before it starts. I did not confront anyone that week. Instead, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Patricia Alvarez, the attorney whose name was on Daniel's trust documents. She confirmed everything in the letter within minutes. "Your husband was very thorough, Mrs. Hayes," she told me. "Legally, no one can sell that house, list it, or make decisions about it without your signature. It's fully and solely yours." The second was to my old friend Ruth Callahan, who I'd worked alongside in hospice care and had since become a paralegal. I called her because Ruth has never once been afraid to say a hard truth out loud, and I needed to hear one. "Ellie," she said after I'd told her everything, "you do not owe your children a smooth landing this time. You owe yourself the truth, said clearly once, in a way they can't talk their way around." The third call I made was to myself. I sat on the porch Daniel built and asked myself honestly what I wanted, not what would keep the peace, but what I wanted. I realized it was for my family to know me as something other than furniture, something other than a property to be inherited efficiently, a woman whose life could be quietly downsized to make room for other people's plans. I decided I would not confront them in private. Private conversations are where people negotiate the story afterward. They minimize, they recontextualize. I needed witnesses, not to humiliate anyone, but because some truths only stick when spoken into a room full of people who already love each other and now have to decide what that love is actually made of. Thanksgiving was 5 weeks away. I decided that Thanksgiving, hosted at my house under the maple tree Daniel and I had planted, was where this would end. Not with shouting. It would end with facts, spoken calmly, because the truth, delivered without apology, is the loudest thing in any room. In the weeks that followed, I went back to work in a manner of speaking. Before I was a nurse or a teacher, I'd managed books for a small hardware chain, and I still knew how to spot a number quietly moved from one column to another. I asked Ruth to help me pull together a full accounting of what reorganizing actually meant. It meant more than I expected. Peter and Danielle had taken out a home equity line of credit against their own house 8 months earlier, using a projected inheritance from my estate as part of their financial planning conversation with their bank. A detail Ruth's contact in banking flagged as unusual. They had already begun spending against a house that wasn't theirs, based on an assumption about my future no one had asked me about. Claire's apartment had come from that same line of credit, money her brother wasn't entitled to. I don't believe Claire knew. She's 31, kind in her own scattered way, and I think she took a generous gift without asking too many questions, the way you don't look too closely at a lifeline when you're drowning. Peter was different. He had done the research. He had made the calls. My son, who I had rocked to sleep in that house, had begun planning around my death, or at minimum my displacement, while I was still very much alive. Discovering all this didn't make me angry, not exactly. It made me unbearably sad, a low hum of grief for a relationship I thought I'd had and apparently hadn't. But sadness can live right alongside clarity. I spent that November quietly preparing, the way you'd prepare for surgery rather than for war. I met with Patricia twice more. I met with Ruth, who organized the documentation into something clear and undeniable. I even drove to Peter's house one afternoon and sat with Danielle over coffee, asking gently whether she'd thought through what it would mean if I simply said no to all of it. She laughed, uncomfortable. "That's not really an option, Eleanor, at your age?" I smiled. "We'll see." The Thanksgiving before, Danielle had brought a brochure, a glossy pamphlet for a place called Sunrise Meadows, all soft lighting and smiling seniors. "Just something I picked up," she'd said. "No pressure, just options." I'd tucked it in a drawer and found it again that November, and reading it with everything else I now knew, it read less like a suggestion and more like a timeline. I kept it. I had a feeling I would need it again, in front of an audience, before this was finished. The morning of Thanksgiving, my kitchen smelled like sage and roasting turkey and the pies I'd learned to make from my own mother. Lily and Sam ran through the house, blissfully unaware. Claire arrived first, hugging me tightly at the door. Peter and Danielle came an hour later, Danielle carrying a green bean casserole with the easy warmth of someone who has no idea her whole understanding of the next decade is about to change. We sat down at 2, the table set with Daniel's mother's china. Sam said grace, thanking God for the turkey and, with the specific honesty of 7-year-olds, for the fact that we get to come here even though Mom says someday we won't have to drive so far. I watched Danielle's face go slightly pale. I watched Peter study his hands. I let dinner proceed normally for the first 20 minutes. I asked about work, about school, poured wine for the adults, and cider for the children. I wanted them settled. I've learned, from a lifetime of difficult conversations with families who didn't want to hear what I had to tell them, that people absorb hard truths best when they aren't already braced for a fight. Then, as Peter reached for a second helping of stuffing, I set down my fork, folded my hands, and said, "Before we get to pie, I'd like to talk about something." The table went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses, before anyone has said anything specific, that something has shifted. "A few weeks ago," I said, my voice even, "I found out that Peter and Danielle have been planning, for some time now, for me to move out of this house. I found out because of a message that was meant for a group chat but wasn't supposed to see. It mentioned that once I was, and I'm quoting here, settled somewhere smaller, this house would basically be theirs." Danielle's fork made a small, sharp sound against her plate. Peter's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Claire looked between her brother and me, confusion and dawning understanding moving across her face in slow motion. "Mom," Peter started, "it wasn't like that. We were just talking, thinking ahead. That's normal. People do that." "I know people plan ahead," I said gently. "I'm not upset that you think about the future, Peter. I'm troubled by what you did with that thinking. You took out a loan against your own home, using an inheritance you assumed you'd receive from a house that was never going to automatically be yours, and you used part of that money to pay for Claire's apartment. Isn't that right?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard at that table. "How do you even—" Danielle started, and then stopped herself, which told me everything I needed to know about whether she'd suspected I might find out. "Your father," I said, looking at Peter now, "left me a letter before he died. He set up a trust more than a year before his heart attack, putting this house solely in my name, so no one could ever pressure me out of it. He noticed the way you'd started talking about this place before I did, and he went to a lawyer in Columbus to protect me from exactly this conversation." Claire had gone very still, her hand over her mouth. "Peter," she said quietly, "the money for the apartment, where did that actually come from?" Peter didn't answer her. He was looking at me instead, something shifting behind his eyes that I recognized, distantly, as the specific shame of being seen clearly by someone you'd assumed you could still manage. I continued, my voice still calm, still even, though my hands had begun, finally, to shake slightly beneath the tablecloth. "Found the brochure for Sunrise Meadows that you left on my counter last Thanksgiving, Danielle. I understand now that it wasn't just a friendly suggestion. And I found the loan paperwork, which Ruth's contact in banking confirmed lists anticipated inheritance from Eleanor Hayes' property as part of your financial planning conversation with the bank, 8 months before you ever mentioned any of this to me directly." "Mom, please," Peter said, and his voice had gone thin now, stripped of the confidence it usually carried. "We weren't trying to hurt you. We thought you'd be lonely out here eventually. We thought it made sense to plan. And yeah, maybe we should have talked to you about it first. But it's not like we were trying to steal anything. This house was always going to come to us eventually anyway. Was it? I said, and for the first time all evening, my voice carried an edge. Not loud, never loud, but unmistakably firm. Because as of 18 months ago, this house belongs entirely to me, in a trust your father set up specifically because he suspected you might try to make decisions about my life without my consent. It is not community property. It is not something that will simply pass to you when I die, unless I choose to structure my will that way, which, given what I've learned this month, I am currently reconsidering entirely. Sam had stopped eating. Lily was looking between the adults with the particular wide-eyed stillness children get when they understand, without yet understanding the details, that something important and painful is happening at the table where they usually feel safest. I want to be very clear, I said, looking now at each of them in turn, Peter, Danielle, Claire, that I am not doing this to punish anyone, and I am not doing this because I don't love you. I have loved you every single day of your lives, without exception, without condition. But love is not the same thing as being used, and I have spent this past month understanding very clearly that somewhere along the way, I stopped being your mother in your eyes and started being an asset you were managing, a house you were planning to inherit, a woman you assumed would eventually get small and quiet enough to move out of the way. That's not fair, Danielle said, some color returning to her face, defensiveness sharpening her voice. We were just trying to be practical. You're not exactly young anymore, Eleanor, and this house is a lot for one person. And honestly, maybe if you'd been more open to having these conversations, instead of finding out through some accidental text message, none of this would have— Danielle, I said, and something in my voice made her stop mid-sentence. You took out a loan against an inheritance that was never guaranteed to you, funded my daughter's apartment with money that was never fully yours to spend, and brought me a retirement home brochure while calling it a friendly suggestion. I don't need you to apologize to me right now. I need you to understand that I know exactly what happened in detail, and that knowing it changes how I see all of you. Claire was crying quietly now, not dramatically, just tears sliding down while she looked at her plate. I didn't know, she said. Peter told me it was from savings. I swear, Mom, I didn't know it was— I believe you, I said, and I meant it. This isn't about you the same way it's about your brother, Claire, but I need you to understand that gifts don't exist in a vacuum. Somebody paid for that, and in this case, it was paid for with an assumption about my death that nobody asked me about. Peter's hands were shaking now too, I noticed, the same tremor I'd been fighting under the table. Mom, what do you want us to do? He said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word want, which was, I think, the first genuinely honest thing he'd said all evening. I want, I said, for you to understand something clearly, because I am only going to say this once, and then we are going to eat pie, because I made 3 of them, and I am not letting this ruin Thanksgiving for Lily and Sam. I am not moving to Sunrise Meadows. I am not signing anything, transferring anything, or agreeing to anything that involves this house, ever, unless it is entirely my own decision. This house belongs to me, legally, completely, because your father loved me enough to protect me from exactly this conversation before he even knew for certain it was coming. And I intend to live in it, under the tree we planted the year you were born, Peter, for as long as I am capable and as long as I choose to. The table was silent except for Sam, who asked in the small, clear voice of a child who has decided the tension has gone on long enough, Grandma, can we still have pie? I laughed, and it broke something loose in my chest that had been tight for weeks. Yes, baby, I said. We can still have pie? We did have pie that day, eaten in a different kind of silence than usual, full of things that would need to be said later, privately, over weeks and possibly years. Peter left early with Danielle and the children, and I remember watching Sam wave from the car window, unaware of everything that had just shifted beneath his family's feet. In the weeks that followed, the fallout unfolded slowly, without the dramatic finality of a movie ending. Peter called me 3 days later, alone, and cried on the phone with me, an ugly, unguarded crying that reminded me of the little boy who used to climb into my lap after nightmares. He told me he was ashamed, that he didn't fully understand how it had happened, how convenient assumptions about aging parents get made in 1,000 small conversations until they calcify into a plan nobody quite remembers agreeing to. I don't think he was lying. I think my son had drifted into cruelty the way people drift into debt, one reasonable-sounding decision at a time until the total came due all at once. I told him the truth, that I loved him, and that loving him did not mean I would ever again let him make decisions about my life without my full participation. We are still rebuilding what that relationship looks like. It is slower than I would like and more honest than it has ever been, and I believe those two things are not a coincidence. Danielle and I have not fully repaired things, and I've made peace with that. Some relationships, once you've seen clearly what they're made of, cannot simply return to what they were. I am kind to her, because Lily and Sam need to see adults handle conflict with dignity, but I no longer mistake her warmth for safety. Claire moved out of the apartment 3 months later, on her own, once she understood where the money had come from. She found a smaller place she pays for herself, and she calls me now every Sunday. I updated my will, with Patricia's help, though not in the punitive way people might expect. The house remains mine for as long as I choose, but I structured the eventual inheritance to protect Lily and Sam specifically, in a trust of their own that activates when they turn 25, regardless of what happens between their parents and me. Whatever mistakes were made at that table, those two children did not choose them, and I was not about to let my grandchildren pay for decisions they had no part in making. I still live in the house on Maple Street. The maple tree Daniel and I planted is taller now than the roofline, and some mornings I still stand at that kitchen window and watch the light move through its branches. I host Sunday dinners again, smaller and quieter than before, slower to trust, the way all repaired things are. Peter comes most weeks now, and we are learning, deliberately, what it means to be honest with each other instead of merely comfortable. People sometimes ask whether I regret staying quiet for so long. I don't. There is a difference between staying silent because you are weak and staying silent because you are gathering the truth carefully enough that no one can talk you out of it later. I was never furniture in that house, even when my family had quietly started treating me like something to be moved around according to their convenience. I think often about what my husband wrote in that letter, protecting me from a threat he could sense before either of us had proof. He knew I would not fight loudly for myself, so he built something sturdy and permanent that would fight for me quietly, the way I had spent my whole life fighting quietly for everyone else. I think that's the truest kind of love there is. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this: kindness without boundaries is a door left unlocked, and eventually someone you love will walk through it and start rearranging the furniture as if the house were already theirs. You can be generous and still say no. You can be soft-spoken and still be the loudest truth in the room when the moment finally calls for it. I didn't stop being a mother that Thanksgiving, and I didn't stop being family. I simply stopped being furniture. And once I did, I found out I had been standing on solid ground the entire time. In a house my husband made sure could never be taken from me, planted beside a tree that has never once needed anyone's permission to keep growing.